get this, we're going deep on some pretty fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes unsettling ideas about how we act when we're, in a crowd.
Yeah.
Ever get that feeling like you're kind of swept up at a concert,
Oh, yeah, totally.
protest, or even like scrolling through comments online?
Oh, for sure.
Like you just get caught up in the energy of everyone around you.
You kind of lose yourself a little bit.
Well, back in 1908, a guy named Gustave Le Bon,
Okay.
he wrote a book called The Psychology of Crowds.
Ah.
And he tried to figure out exactly why that happens. So we've got some excerpts from that book.
Okay.
And we're going to try to unpack it a little, see what he got right,
Right.
what's maybe changed over time,
Yeah.
and most importantly, what it all means for you.
I think what's so interesting about Le Bon is he was writing at a time when the world was like starting to see the rise of mass media,
Yeah.
large-scale social movements. He was trying to understand these new forces shaping society.
Right.
He believed that like the key to all of this was understanding the psychology of crowds.
So he wasn't just talking about a bunch of people like crammed on the subway.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
What did he actually mean by a crowd, psychologically speaking?
He actually believed that when people come together in a certain way, they form what he called the psychological crowd.
Okay.
It's not just about physical proximity, right? It's
Right.
more about a shared mindset. He believed that individual consciousness kind of fades away,
Wow.
and this new collective mind kind of emerges.
I guess.
Imagine like a rock concert.
Yeah.
Thousands of people moving and singing as one.
Yeah.
Individually, they might have totally different opinions, different beliefs, different
Right.
personalities even.
Sure.
But in that moment,
Yeah.
they're all swept up in the same
Right.
energy.
It's a little freaky when you think about it. Like, we become something totally different, not just like a sum of our parts.
Yeah, exactly. And Le Bon argues that this collective mind has its own unique characteristics
Right.
that make crowds behave very differently from how individuals behave. He even said that it happens, regardless of how smart, how educated, or even what kind of personality each person has.
So you're telling me a room full of Nobel Prize winners could theoretically act just as impulsively as like a group of, I don't know, teenagers at a football game?
That was Le Bon's argument.
Wow.
Yeah, he believed that in a crowd, individual reasoning kind of takes a back seat
Okay.
to emotion and instinct. He even compared crowds to like primitive beings,
Wow.
easily swayed by external stimuli, reacting more than thinking.
So, okay, that makes the concert example make a little more sense.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of scary, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're all so easily influenced in a crowd, what does that mean for, I don't know, like our decision making?
Yeah.
Like, could we be manipulated without even realizing it?
Yeah. And Le Bon was definitely concerned about that. He believed that understanding the psychology of crowds was crucial, particularly for people in positions of power.
Right, because if you know how they work, you might just know how to influence them.
Exactly.
So let's get into like the nuts and bolts of what makes crowds tick, according to Le Bon.
Okay.
He had some pretty specific ideas about the characteristics of this, this crowd psychology.
He did, yeah. He identified kind of 4 key characteristics.
Yeah.
Impulsivity and changeability.
Okay.
Suggestibility and credulity.
Gotcha.
Exaggeration and simplicity of feelings, and a tendency toward intolerance and authoritarianism.
So crowds are basically like impulsive, gullible, overly emotional, and kind of bossy.
Well, it's a little more nuanced than that.
Sure.
But you're getting the idea.
Okay.
So like take impulsivity, for example.
Yeah.
Le Bon described crowds as incredibly reactive.
Okay.
Almost like a dry leaf caught in a gust of wind.
Okay.
Easily shifted by the slightest trigger.
So we're talking about mood swings on a massive scale.
Exactly.
Okay.
Think about how quickly a peaceful protest can turn violent.
Right.
Or how a celebratory gathering can descend into chaos.
Yeah.
Crowds can swing from one extreme emotion to another in the blink of an eye.
All right. That explains the impulsivity part.
Yeah.
But what about suggestibility?
Okay.
How does that play out, in a crowd setting?
So Le Bon believed that crowds are incredibly susceptible to suggestion. They readily accept ideas without much, critical thought.
Right.
He even said that crowds are prone to what he called collective hallucinations, where...
Wait, hold on. Collective hallucinations? Like what, a mass ghost sighting or something?
It sounds crazy, but he documented cases where this seemed to happen.
Really?
Imagine being in a crowd where everyone around you is convinced they're seeing something,
Yeah.
even if you're not. It'd be pretty hard to resist that kind of social pressure.
I guess that explains how, like, rumors and conspiracy theories can spread so fast.
Yeah.
You just get swept up in the belief of the group.
Exactly. And this ties into the next characteristic, right?
Okay.
The exaggeration and simplification of feelings.
Okay.
Le Bon believed that crowd emotions are both simple and exaggerated, lacking nuance.
Okay.
He argued this is because individuals feel a sense of anonymity within the crowd,
Right.
which makes them less inhibited in expressing their emotions.
So it's like the normal social filters that keep our emotions, in check, get tossed out the window when we're part of a crowd.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this brings us to the last characteristic, intolerance and authoritarianism.
All right.
Le Bon believed that crowds have a strong need for authority figures and are intolerant of, dissenting opinions.
Okay.
They crave a sense of order and direction,
Right.
especially when they're feeling, overwhelmed or uncertain.
So in a way, crowds are kind of looking for someone to tell them what to think and how to feel. Someone to, like, make sense of the chaos.
In essence, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And this desire for, strong leadership
Mm-hmm.
can make crowds vulnerable to manipulation,
Right.
especially by, charismatic figures who know how to tack into these, deep-seated psychological
Okay,
nets.
so this is painting a pretty intense picture of crowd behavior.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
We've got impulsivity, suggestibility,
Right.
heightened emotions,
Yeah.
a craving for strong leadership.
Yeah.
It's almost like a recipe for both greatness and disaster,
Yeah.
depending on who's at the helm.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And that leads us to the next question, right?
Okay.
Like, what factors did Le Bon believe shaped the specific beliefs that a crowd might hold?
Right, right.
What makes one crowd embrace a revolutionary idea
Yeah.
while another clings to tradition?
Right, right.
That's where things get even more complex.
Okay, well, I'm ready to dive deeper. Let's unpack what Le Bon had to say about the forces that shape crowd beliefs.
All right. So he identified several key factors,
Okay.
and some of them are definitely more controversial than others.
Yeah.
He considered race to be the most significant factor,
Okay.
arguing that it determined the fundamental beliefs and character of a crowd.
Yeah. I'm guessing that's one of the parts that hasn't aged so well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. That's a perspective that's been largely discredited by modern science and social thought.
Okay, yeah. Putting that aside,
Yeah.
what were some of the other factors Le Bon discussed?
So he also emphasized the role of tradition.
Yeah, okay.
He saw tradition as a powerful force
Yeah.
that provides a sense of continuity and shared identity,
Yeah.
which can be, very influential in shaping a crowd's beliefs.
It's like that feeling of belonging and shared history.
Right.
We see that play out all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, whether it's like family traditions or cultural customs or even just the rituals we have in our friend groups.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Le Bon also highlighted the role of time.
Okay.
He believed that time is a powerful force that gradually transforms beliefs,
Yeah.
even ones that seem, deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
Think about how much social attitudes have shifted
Right.
over the last century.
It's like that old saying, the only constant is change.
Yeah.
So even the most deeply held beliefs
Right.
aren't immune to the effects of time.
What about institutions?
Okay.
Did Le Bon think they played a role in shaping crowd beliefs?
He did, but he argued that institutions were less important than people often assume.
Okay.
He saw them as kind of outward expressions of a crowd's underlying beliefs,
Okay.
rather than the source of those beliefs.
So the institutions themselves don't shape beliefs as much as they reflect the beliefs that already exist within the crowd.
Right, exactly.
Interesting. Did he talk about education at all? He did. And he was quite critical of the education systems of his time. He believed they focused too much on, rote learning and classical subjects,
Yeah.
which he felt made people unfit for practical life and fostered social unrest.
Right.
He argued for an education system that emphasized practical skills and critical thinking.
That's actually pretty forward thinking
Yeah.
for the early 1900s.
Yeah.
So according to Le Bon, it's not enough to just fill people's heads with facts and figures.
Right.
You have to teach them how to think for themselves, how to question what they're told, and how to apply knowledge to, real world situations.
Right.
Do you think he was onto something there?
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that perspective.
Yeah.
Le Bon saw critical thinking as like a crucial antidote
Yeah.
to the potential for manipulation in crowds.
Makes sense.
If we're able to think critically, we're less likely to be swayed by emotional appeals
Right.
or blindly follow charismatic leaders.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp of what crowds are like according to Le Bon and some of the things that shape their beliefs.
Yeah.
But how did he think crowds were actually, influenced and persuaded?
Okay.
Let's get into the tactics.
This is where it gets really interesting. Le Bon believed that crowds were primarily swayed by emotions and imagery,
Okay.
not logic or rational arguments.
So basically like appealing to their hearts rather than their heads.
Exactly.
Okay.
He argued that skilled leaders use powerful words and imagery
Right.
to evoke strong emotional responses in crowds.
That makes sense. Think about all the powerful speeches and symbols throughout history, right?
Yeah.
That have rallied people to action.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he also highlighted the power of repetition.
Okay.
He believed that repeatedly stating an idea could make it seem true,
Right.
even if there's no evidence to support it.
The old repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth tactic. Didn't he also talk about the idea of contagion?
He did, yeah.
Okay.
He believed that ideas and emotions could spread through a crowd, like a contagious disease, taking hold rapidly
Right.
and influencing behavior.
Think about how quickly panic can spread through a crowd, or even how a good mood can be infectious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the role of prestige.
Okay.
Le Bon argued that people with prestige, whether earned or inherited, have a disproportionate influence on crowds.
So we're talking celebrities, politicians, religious leaders.
Yeah.
Anyone seen as an authority figure?
Yes, and he argued that this influence is rooted in our deep-seated instincts
Yeah.
to follow those we perceive as strong or powerful. In the past, following a strong leader
Right.
could mean the difference between, survival and, well, not surviving.
Right. It makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah.
But in today's world, it also makes us vulnerable to those who might abuse that power.
That was Le Bon's concern. He believed that understanding these mechanisms of influence
Right.
was crucial for safeguarding against the potential dangers of crowd behavior.
So knowing all this, how did Le Bon view the role of crowds in shaping, history and society?
Okay.
Were they a force for good, for bad, or maybe a bit of both?
Le Bon believed that crowds have been the driving force behind, major historical events.
Okay.
He pointed to revolutions,
Yeah.
religious movements, even the rise and fall of empires,
Wow.
attributing these monumental shifts to the collective will of crowds.
Yeah.
He believed that the course of history was ultimately determined by the beliefs and actions of crowds.
That's a lot of responsibility to place on groups that are often driven by, emotion and instinct
Right.
rather than reason.
Yeah, and that was Le Bon's point. He believed it was essential for individuals to be aware of the potential pitfalls of crowd behavior
Right.
and to develop critical thinking skills
Okay.
to avoid, being swept away by the tide of collective emotion. He saw crowds as capable of great good and great evil, depending on the ideas and leaders they followed.
So kind of a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
Able to achieve amazing things, but also susceptible to manipulation and destruction.
Exactly. That's the paradox of crowd psychology.
Yeah.
And it's a paradox that's as relevant today as it was in Le Bon's time.
All right. That's a lot to digest.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground here, exploring Le Bon's ideas about what makes crowds tick, how they're influenced, and their role in, shaping history. But how does all of this apply to our world today? We'll dig into that in just a bit. Okay, so we've been going over Le Bon's theories about crowds, and honestly, some of it is kind of, unnerving.
Right.
I mean, if we're all that easy to sway with emotions and susceptible to manipulation, especially when we're with other people, are we doomed to just repeat the mistakes of the past? Are we all just puppets dancing to the tune of, powerful leaders and clever marketing?
Mm-hmm. It's a big question. Is what makes Le Bon so thought-provoking, really? He definitely pointed out the dangers of crowd behavior. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that he thought we were totally powerless.
Right.
Remember, he talked about education and critical thinking as like the countermeasures.
Right, yeah. He saw those as key to resisting being manipulated. But I'm curious about the actual, tactics that he said people use. We talked about powerful words and imagery and repetition. It almost sounded like mind control.
It's true. He recognized how powerful language could be, especially when you have a really good speaker or somebody who's good at propaganda. He wasn't saying it was literally mind control, but he did think that certain words and phrases, they have almost a hypnotic effect on people, especially in crowds.
Like, give me an example. What kind of magic words are we talking about here?
Think about words like freedom, justice, equality. They carry so much weight, they've got so much history, even if what they mean is totally up in the air. You put these words in front of a crowd, and boom, you've got unity, outrage, hope, all without really even thinking about it.
It's like these words act as a shortcut to a feeling. You get a gut reaction before you even process what they actually mean.
Yeah, exactly. And LeBlanc pointed out that sometimes the most effective words, they're actually kind of vague. They let people in the crowd project their own baggage onto those words. Hopes and fears and all that. He even said that sometimes the people using these words, they don't even fully understand how powerful they are themselves.
So even the manipulators are being manipulated in a way. We're all caught up in these symbols and emotions, and nobody's really in control.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. Really gets you thinking about free will and like, do we have any agency when we're in a crowd? If the leaders are just being swept along too, then who's really calling the shots?
Whoa, now we're going deep.
Right.
Okay, but let's come back up for air for a second. Besides strong words, what else did LeBlanc talk about?
Oh, he was really into repetition.
Yeah.
He saw it as a main way to shape what people believe, even if the message itself is fake or, misleading. He talked about advertising and how if you see a slogan enough times, you start to believe a product is better, even if it's really no different.
It's like when you hear that jingle for that sugary cereal you haven't eaten since you were a kid. It's not rational, but all of a sudden you're craving it.
That's it. LeBon's point was that repetition, it sort of hacks the unconscious part of your mind. The more you see something, the more normal it seems. So, propaganda, they just repeat the same simple message over and over.
It's like your brain just gets tired and gives in. Fine, I'll buy your stupid cereal. Just make the jingle stop.
Right, yeah, exactly. And then, you have this concept of contagion. We talked about that a bit before, how ideas and emotions, they can move through a crowd like they're a virus. It jumps from one person to another, even without them touching.
Yeah, he talked about panic spreading, but I guess it could also be for good things. Like, that feeling when a stadium goes crazy after the winning goal?
Oh, totally, yeah. Think about laughter, excitement, how easily that stuff spreads. LeBon's theory was that emotions, whether they're good or bad, they're super contagious in crowds.
It's like that energy is almost a real thing, like you can touch it.
Right. And that brings us to the last tactic that LeBon talked about, prestige. He said people with prestige, whether they earned it or just like were born with it, they have a huge influence on crowds.
Okay, so that's the authority figures against celebrities, experts.
Yes, exactly. Think about how much stock you put in, what people you admire say. He thought we're just hardwired to defer to authority, even if we don't realize it.
It's like if so-and-so jumped off a bridge, would you jump too?
We follow the leader. That's built into us.
Exactly. And LeBon's point was that this tendency, yeah, it's good sometimes, but it also makes us vulnerable to leaders who are just really good at being charismatic, even if they're not on our side. Right, so we've got these 4 tactics. Powerful words, repeating stuff, this contagion idea, and prestige. It's like a manual for how to control people. Did LeBon think these tactics were actually used throughout history?
Oh, he argued that crowds were behind almost all the big shifts in history, the good and the bad. He talked about revolutions in religion, empires rising and falling. He said all of that came down to the will of the crowd.
Yeah.
Like the whole course of history is decided by what crowds believe and do.
So crowds can overthrow governments, start wars, even make whole new societies.
That's what he thought, yeah. He said crowds could be amazingly creative and brave and self-sacrificing, but also incredibly destructive and violent. It all depends on what they're following.
That's inspiring and scary all at the same time. It's like we have all this power together, but it could go either way.
That's it, exactly. LeBon was saying that we have to understand this power and how to influence it. It's the key to making a better future. He thought education and being able to think for yourself, those are the ways to make sure crowds do good things, instead of just causing chaos.
So it's not enough to just know how crowds work. We have to learn how to use that power in a good way.
That's right. We need to be aware of what people are doing to manipulate us, whether it's as individuals or as a group. We have to think critically and, be aware of how our emotions can be used against us, especially when we're with other people.
Okay, so sounds like we've got work to do.
We do.
But before we get into what all of this means for us now and how to navigate this whole crowd psychology thing, let's take stock of what we've learned from Le Bon so far. So we spent all this time with Gustave Le Bon and his crowd psychology. It's been a wild ride. I mean, we talked about how crowds get impulsive and suggestible and how their emotions just go through the roof and how all of that can be twisted by, a good leader or just the energy of the crowd itself. But I gotta ask, does all this stuff still hold up today? I mean, Le Bon was writing like over 100 years ago, before the internet, before social media, before we were all connected like we are now.
It's the question, isn't it? And the crazy thing is, a lot of what Le Bon said, it still fits with how crowds act today, even with all the tech and how we connect now.
So you're saying even though we've got all this tech, human psychology, like how we act in groups, it hasn't really changed that much.
That's a big part of it, yeah. We're still wired to react to stuff that gets us emotional, you know? We still want to be part of a group, and we look to leaders when things are uncertain or scary.
Okay, so if that's true, how does Le Bon's theory fit into today's world? Got any examples of how his ideas are still relevant?
Tons. Think about how fast information goes around online, especially on those social media sites. It's like, bam, it's everywhere, driven by emotion, and good luck figuring out what's real and what's not. It's almost like that contagion idea Le Bon had, but it's digital now. Ideas and feelings, they just jump from one person to another, and nobody's really stopping to think.
It's that whole thing like a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on.
Exactly. And you know how those social media algorithms, they like stuff that's engaging, which usually means stuff that gets people riled up, right?
Yeah.
So it creates the perfect setup for all that crowd stuff Le Bon was talking about.
So these algorithms, they're tapping into our basic instincts, feeding us all this outrage and fear and excitement, even if it's not even real.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Mm.
And what happens? Misinformation spreads, conspiracy theories, even hate speech. We've seen it so much in the past few years, and it has real-world consequences.
It's like all of Le Bon's worst fears, but it's happening to the whole world.
Yeah, in a way. But I think what Le Bon was saying, it shouldn't make us feel hopeless, more like it's a warning. If we get how this stuff works, we can figure out how to, like, lessen the bad stuff and use the power of crowds for good.
Okay, so how do we do that? How can we as individuals stop ourselves from getting pulled into all the bad stuff, especially online? Should we all just delete our social media and hide in a cave?
I don't think it's got to be that extreme. Connecting with people is important, and tech can be a good thing. But we do need to be more careful about the information we're taking in. We got to learn to think critically and not fall for stuff that's just trying to push our buttons.
So it's about recognizing those tactics, right? Like the loaded words and images that we talked about before.
Right. When you see something that makes you mad or scared, take a second before you share it. Ask yourself, is this even true? Who's saying it? Am I just reacting, or am I thinking about this with a clear head?
Like, don't believe everything you read on the internet, that old saying. But it's more important than ever now to be skeptical, check where stuff comes from, and be aware of our own biases.
For sure. And we got to get information from lots of different places. Don't just get your news from one source or just from people who think the same way you do. See what other perspectives are out there, even if they make you uncomfortable.
Get out of our echo chambers, online and offline. Talk to people who see things differently, even if it's hard.
Exactly. And remember, Le Bon was big on education being the way to stop crowds from being manipulated. He wanted a system where critical thinking and practical skills were front and center, so people could be smart, engaged citizens. I think that's even more true today, with how much information is flying around.
So it's not just about us doing our part. It's about making a society that values critical thinking, teaches us about media, and makes space for open, respectful conversation.
Absolutely. And if we can pull that off, maybe we can start using the power of crowds in a good way to create change, to make new stuff, to build a better future together.
That's a lot more optimistic than what Le Bon thought. But it's going to take a lot of work from all of us.
It will, yeah. But I think understanding crowd psychology, what it can do and how it can mess us up, that's the first step.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. Before we wrap up, is there one thing you want to leave our listeners with?
I think what Le Bon showed us is that crowds can be a huge force for change, but they're easily swayed by emotions and people trying to use them. If we want to use that power for good, we got to learn how to think critically, be aware of our own biases, and have real conversations with people who disagree with us. We all have a part to play in shaping what our society believes and does.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into crowd psychology. It's been fascinating and, yeah, a little scary at times. We'll leave you with one last thought. If crowds really are guided by stuff we don't even fully understand, like Le Bon said, can we ever really control where we're all going? Until next time, keep those brains working.